The market smelled like burnt fat and desperation. Kara Voss had been in enough occupied territories to know the difference between a place that was poor and a place that had been made poor. This was the second kind. The stalls were thin, the goods were thin, the people were thin, and above all of it, in the towers that ringed the old city of Vel Areth, the Crethvay's signal lanterns burned their cold violet light, watching. She kept her head down. The cloak was local cut, stolen off a line in the lower district, smelling of something she didn't want to identify. Under it she wore the last working pieces of her field kit, the kinetic bracer on her left forearm, a 6-round compact slug thrower in the small of her back, and a ceramic blade that wouldn't show on any Crethvay scanner. Standard loadout for a soldier who wasn't supposed to exist on a world where humanity had officially never landed. Command had been very clear about that part. She stopped at a food cart near the center of the market. The vendor was an old man, Velen by the look of him, one of the planet's indigenous population, shorter than humans, with eyes that sat too high on a face designed to look in two directions at once. He ladled something thick and gray into a bowl and handed it to the man in front of her without speaking, because everyone here had learned not to speak unless they needed to. That was when she saw the girl. She was crouched at the base of the cart, knees pulled to her chest, watching the bowl in the old man's hands with the particular focus of a child who had stopped expecting things and was now only observing. She might have been 7 years old or 9. Kara was bad at alien ages. Small, though, definitely small. Her clothes were a single wrapped piece of coarse fabric, dirty at the hem and clutched against her chest, held the way children hold things that are their last and only thing, was a carved figure. It was a good carving. Someone who loved this child had made it, a small 4-legged animal, polished smooth by handling, with its head raised like it was listening for something. The girl unwrapped her arms. She looked at the figure for a moment. Then she held it out to the old man. He looked at it, he looked at her, he looked away. Kara watched him do the math of it, a man who had nothing trying to decide how much nothing he could afford to give. His face went through something complicated, and he took the carving and put it on the shelf behind him, and ladled out a small bowl and set it in front of the girl, and the girl took it with both hands and didn't look up again. Kara stepped to the cart. She put 2 Velcoin on the counter, real ones, local denomination, she'd exchanged at the border post 3 days ago. The carving, she said, in the trade dialect she drilled on the long drop-in. I'd like to buy it. The old man looked at her for a long time. Then he took the figure from the shelf and pushed it across the counter. Kara picked it up. The carving was warm from the shelf, lighter than it looked, the 4-legged animal's ears worn smooth from 1,000 small fingers. She turned and crouched down to the girl's level. The girl looked up from her bowl. Her eyes were the pale amber of most Velans, but there was something underneath the blankness that all occupied world children developed, something that had not yet entirely given up. Kara held out the carving. The girl stared at it. Then she looked at Kara, really looked, the way people stopped looking at soldiers after a while because they'd learned not to. She was trying to understand the shape of what was happening, because nothing worked like this here anymore. Things didn't come back. Things went away and stayed away, and you learned not to watch the direction they'd gone. Kara just waited. The girl reached out and took it. She held it against her chest again immediately, both arms wrapped tight, and looked back down at her bowl, and Kara stood back up and walked away from the cart before she could ruin it by turning around. She had a mission to complete. She had been in this city for 36 hours, and she had 48 more before the extraction window closed, and between now and then she needed to breach the Crethvay garrison at the old palace, recover a dimensional transit device the Crethvay called the Veltiamond, and get out of the city without being killed or converted. That was the word the briefing had used, converted. Like it was a religion. The Crethvay were old, older than the Terran expansion, older than the first colony ships, possibly older than the species that had built those ships. They had arrived at Vel Arith 4 years ago and done what they always did, moved in from the edges, disabled the infrastructure, split the population into those who cooperated and those who were converted, which meant those who remained human in everything but intent. Converted Velans looked the same, moved the same. But the light in their eyes went the color of old amber, and they stopped making decisions of their own. And they didn't sleep, and they didn't eat, and they only moved in the directions the Krethve pointed them. The garrison at the old palace held an entire converted division. Command called the transit device a priority extraction. They had a different word for what happened if they didn't get it, which was strategic loss, which was a clean way of saying that the Krethve would use it to cross the next dimensional fold and appear behind the Terran fleet at Reach Station, and then there wouldn't be a Terran fleet anymore. Kara had been selected for this mission for 2 reasons. The first was that her psych profile showed high resistance to conversion, something about baseline dopamine architecture that the Krethve neural influence couldn't easily hook into. Command's words, not hers. She thought of it as being too stubborn to be turned into something else. The second reason was that she was the only volunteer. She walked through the market and up through the tiered streets of Vel Arith toward the old palace, which sat on the hill above the city like a crown that belonged to someone who no longer wore it. The Krethve had strung their signal lanterns along its towers and planted their guard constructs at the gates and called it a garrison. But underneath all of that it was still the old palace, with the old architecture, which her briefing packet had included in exhaustive detail, because someone at command had been thorough about the one thing they could be thorough about. The sewer system ran under the east wing. The east wing had a door. The guard construct at the sewer access was about the size of a large dog and moved nothing like one. It had 4 articulated limbs, but they bent in too many places, and it moved in the stuttering half-stop way that all Krethve automation moved, like something that understood motion but found it vaguely offensive. It was scanning a 2-meter radius, which meant there was a 2-meter gap every time it completed its rotation. Kara had spent 4 hours in the shadows of the service tunnel watching it. She had a particular relationship with time that most of her instructors had mistaken for patience. It wasn't patience. It was stubbornness expressed as waiting, the refusal to move until the situation had given her an actual option instead of a bad one. She'd been cashiered out of 2 rapid response units for it, and recruited into deep infiltration because of it, which told her something about how the military felt about the quality of its options. The construct completed its rotation. She moved. The ceramic blade went through the construct's sensory node before it completed the half-turn, and she held it in place while the thing went through 3 seconds of what she could only describe as confusion, the limbs performing small, purposeless motions, the signal emitter cycling through frequencies that found nothing to report to, and then it stopped. She lowered it gently, because the sound of it falling would carry, and slid through the access door and into the dark. The tunnel smelled of age and old water, and something metallic and sweet that she'd learned to associate with Krethve installations. Their waste processes left a residue. One more thing that was wrong about them, one more way they sat wrong in the world they were occupying. She moved through the tunnel with one hand on the wall and the briefing packet's map in her head, counting junctions. 3 left, 1 right, up the secondary passage where the old city's drainage system met the palace's original foundation, through the gap where the stonework had settled over 5 centuries and the mortar had given up. The gap was exactly as advertised. She went through it sideways, pack first, and came up inside the palace's lower storeroom, where crates of Krethve equipment were stacked in columns that reached the ceiling. The equipment glowed faintly in the dark. Everything they made glowed faintly, like it was trying to signal something to a receiver that wasn't there. She checked the bracer. The transit device was radiating at a frequency the bracer's scanner could follow, a low pulse like a heartbeat. According to the briefing, it was being held in the old throne room on the third level, which was where the senior HFY commander had established its quarters. Commander. The briefing had actually used the word commander, which was a human concept applied to something that did not have commanders in any way that word meant. The HFY's ranking system worked by something closer to density. More powerful individuals occupied more space in the shared consciousness, pulled the others into alignment the way a gravity well pulled debris. The one at the center of this garrison signal web was called HFY Emollient in their own designation system, which translated roughly to the one that does not diminish. On Vel Arith, everyone called it simply Kreth. She had 15 minutes before the guard construct's absence would be logged. She started climbing. The third-level corridor was wrong before she was halfway down it. Not wrong in any way the scanner would catch. The temperature was ambient. The signal frequencies were background noise. Nothing moved in the darkness ahead. But Kara had spent 6 years in spaces where things could kill her, and there was a quality to the air in the corridor that reminded her of a held breath, like the corridor was waiting. She stopped, put her back to the wall, listened. There was music. Not music the way she thought of music, no rhythm, no melody she could find a pattern in. A series of tones that repeated without quite repeating, each cycle slightly different from the last, like something working out a problem in sound. It came from the door at the end of the corridor, which was not the throne room. The throne room was to the right. This was to the left. She should have gone right. She went left 3 steps and stopped again, because she was not an idiot and made herself account for why she was doing this. The music had no tactical value. Investigating it consumed time she needed. There was no logical reason to walk toward it. And yet the quality of the corridor had changed. The held breath feeling was gone. Something about the tones, the way they almost repeated without repeating, was putting something in her that she hadn't had since the sewer tunnel, which was a mild and manageable sense that she was not alone, and that the thing she was not alone with was not necessarily hostile. She was a soldier, not a mystic. She didn't trust feelings. But she also didn't trust the sudden absence of the feeling that had told her something was wrong. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was a storage space of some kind, or had been. Now it held a single HFY of the lesser caste, smaller than the garrison soldiers, limbs arranged differently, the signal lantern eyes set closer together. It was crouched in the corner with its back to the door, and it was producing the music from somewhere in its thorax, and it stopped when she entered and turned very slowly and looked at her. Its eyes were not amber. They were the blue-violet of the HFY who had not yet been fully integrated into the hive signal, the color of someone standing in the doorway. They looked at each other for a moment. "You are the human," it said, in trade dialect badly. "Most of the time," she said. It stood. It was wrong-shaped in the way all of them were, too many joints in too many places, but the way it stood was not threatening. It was more like the way something stands when it's trying to prove it's not going to bite. "I am called Ren," it said. "In your language it is approximate." "Approximate to what?" "The sound is more like, it produced a chord from its thorax that had 4 notes in it. There is no word. Ren is adequate." She kept her hand near the slug thrower. "Why are you here, Ren?" "I am not aligned," it said. "I have not been aligned for a long time. I have been here because here they do not look for misalignment. The garrison commander does not expect misalignment in the lower castes." Something moved through its expression that she didn't have a word for. "It is correct about most of us." "But not you." "I have been watching you since the market," it said. "I saw what you did for the child." She didn't answer that. "It was unnecessary," it said, and there was something in the way it used the word, something almost wondering, the way you describe a color you'd only read about. "It gave you nothing. It slowed you. It created risk. And yet you did it, and the doing of it was the only thing that happened in this city today that was not done because something required it. She still didn't answer. I want to show you where the Veltiamond is being kept, it said, and I want to come with you when you leave. Kara looked at it for a long time. 6 years of reading rooms told her that the creature in front of her was not faking anything. Not because it couldn't, but because it was putting itself at the center of the most exposed position available with no fallback, and nothing that had a fallback stood that way. The throne room is right, she said. I already know where it is. The throne room is a decoy, Ren said. There is a device in the throne room. It will emit the correct signature until it is disturbed, at which point it will broadcast a garrison alert signal and send a current through the floor that will stop your heart. A pause. The actual Veltiamond is in Kreth's chamber, the one below the throne room, the one that is not on your maps. She had trusted worse bets. Show me, she said. Ren moved through the palace the way something moves when it grew up in the walls, not sneaking, not exactly, but inhabiting the spaces between attention. It didn't look for gaps in the guard rotations. It seemed to exist in the gaps naturally, the way water finds the low places. She followed it down through a service passage that didn't appear on any blueprint she'd seen, carved from the original stone and retrofitted with Krethve conduit along the walls. The palace's skeleton rebuilt with alien nerves. The signal lanterns here pulsed at a slower frequency, something between watchfulness and sleep. Why aren't you aligned? She asked, because she was going to trust this creature with her life and she wanted to understand the thing she was trusting. I was, it said, not stopping. For a long time it is not unpleasant, it is like, it thought. You have a word, warm. Warm. You are warm in alignment. You are never cold, never alone, never uncertain. There is always the signal, and the signal is always enough. A pause, 2 steps, another passage branching left. But I heard something once outside the alignment, a sound that was not any frequency the signal uses. I did not know what it was. What was it? A child, it said. A Velen child in the lower city before the full conversion. She was singing something. I could not. Another pause longer. I could not account for it. Within the alignment, the signal explains all sound as communication or noise. This was neither. It was not sending information. It was not random. It was. It made the chord again, the 4-note sound it had called its own name. Music, she said. I did not have the word yet. I have it now. It stopped at a junction and turned to look at her with its 2 close eyes. I listened to the sound, and the alignment noticed that I had stopped processing, and it tried to redirect my attention, and I realized in that moment that the alignment could try, that there was a part of me that could be tried at, that there was a part of me that the signal did not already own. Kara looked at it. The girl from the market, she said, was that. Same child, it said, and turned back to the passage. She has survived here by being small and uninteresting. I have tried to ensure that continues. They walked in silence for a moment. You've been protecting her. Inadequately, it said, which she thought was the most honest thing she'd heard said on this planet. Come. Kreth's chamber was below the floor of the throne room, reached by a passage that opened behind a hanging of some dark material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The chamber was large enough that Kara felt the walls before she could see them, the way you feel a space by the quality of the air. It was cooler here. The signal lanterns burned at a different frequency, slower, deeper, violet black rather than violet white. Kreth was not in the chamber. Where she started. The garrison is preparing for a command review, Ren said. Kreth conducts them personally. It will be 3 floors above us for the next 40 minutes. She looked at Ren. I have been planning this for a long time, it said. The Veltiamond was in the center of the chamber on a plinth that was not a plinth. It was a containment field generator, the device sitting inside a structure of standing energy that bent the light around it. The Tiamond itself was smaller than she'd expected. about the size of her closed fist, a crystalline structure that was clear in some lights and deepest blue in others, currently cycling between the two as the containment field pulsed. She could feel it in the bracer even standing 10 feet away. The low heartbeat of it, the sense of distance folded over on itself, of here and elsewhere pressed together at a single point. She'd been briefed on how to disengage the containment. She drilled it. She walked to the plinth and looked at the field structure and found every reassurance the briefing had given her going quiet and small in her head, because the field structure was more complex than the briefing had described, and there was a secondary layer she hadn't been told about, and the secondary layer was putting out a signal she didn't recognize. Ren. Yes. The secondary layer, what is it? Ren was beside her before she finished the question. It studied the field for a moment with the particular stillness of something that was doing calculations. A nervous system monitor, it said. Kreth calibrated this itself. The containment will hold as long as the primary anchor is active, but the secondary layer is another pause. It is measuring fear. It's measuring fear. A human who attempts to disengage the primary field while experiencing acute fear response will trigger the secondary layer, which will. It stopped. Which will what? There is not a precise translation. It will invite you into alignment, very quickly and very permanently. Kara looked at the field. She looked at the Tiamen cycling between clear and deep blue inside it. She looked at her own hands, which were not shaking, which she took a moment to note and approve of. Okay, she said. You understand what I described. I understood it fine. She examined the primary field structure. The disengagement sequence was what the briefing had said, a specific pattern of contact points on the field generator, applied in order, 6 contacts. She drilled it until she could do it in the dark. The field doesn't know what it's measuring in me. It's calibrated for fear response based on Krethve assumptions about humans. Signal fear, survival override. It's looking for the specific neural pattern that happens when something realizes it might die. Yes, Ren said carefully. I've been realizing I might die every day for 6 years, she said. I don't know what my baseline reads as to a Krethve sensor, but I'd bet significant money it doesn't look like what they think fear looks like. That is not a comforting argument. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be accurate. She looked at the field contacts. Stay back. If this goes wrong, the transit device is still the priority. Get it to the extraction point. Coordinates are in my pack front pocket. Ren said nothing. She didn't look back to see what its expression was doing. She put her hands on the first contact. The field was warm. Not unpleasantly, the warmth of something that was meant to hold something precious, she thought, the warmth of care expressed as energy. She found the second contact and pressed it, and the field made a sound like a held breath released. Found the third, the fourth. Her hands were steady. She had been doing a thing for years that looked like patience, and she understood now that it was also this. The capacity to be in the most dangerous moment she'd ever been in, and not have the part of her that registered danger override the part of her that knew what to do next. Fifth contact. The secondary layer pulsed. She felt it, not as sound or sensation exactly, more as presence, the way you feel someone standing behind you in a dark room. A large, old, very certain intelligence pressing against the edges of her awareness, looking for the gap that fear left open, the invitation that survival panic extended. She thought about the girl in the market. The carved figure pressed against her chest like it was the only sure thing in the world. The way she'd looked when it was handed back to her. That specific arrested moment where something you'd given up for lost comes back, and you don't know yet if you're allowed to want it. She put her hand on the sixth contact. The field collapsed. She caught the Tiamen with both hands as the containment structure released it. It was cold. Colder than she'd expected after the warm field. Cold the way the spaces between stars were cold. cold and very still and humming against her palms with contained potential. She held it and breathed and waited for the secondary layer to do something. And it didn't. And then she was putting it in the inner pocket of the cloak and sealing the pocket and looking up at Ren. Ren was staring at her. "The secondary layer," it said. "It tried." "I know." "You did not, your signal did not, there was nothing for it to." It stopped, started again. "What were you thinking about?" She was already moving toward the passage. "Nothing tactical," she said. "Come on." They were one level up, and moving through the service corridor when the garrison alert sounded. It was not the subtle pulse she'd been watching for on the bracer. It was every signal lantern in the palace going to full burn simultaneously, violet white harsh enough to read by, accompanied by a tone that resonated in her back teeth. Somewhere above them, the converted division was moving. She could feel it in the floor, 200 pairs of feet, perfectly synchronized, the sound of intelligence without individuals. "The guard construct," Ren said. "It's been 3 hours. I expected this 15 minutes ago." She was already running the math. The extraction window was 40 hours away. She'd been planning to hold position in the lower city until then, but that option was closing at the speed of the garrison alert spreading through Vel Arith streets. Exit routes. North sewer access is compromised. The garrison will seal the lower accesses within. It did something with its thorax. 4 minutes. There is a secondary exit through the old granary on the west wall. It emerges outside the garrison perimeter. But Kreth will be moving to the Tiaman chamber when it finds the chamber empty. The floor moved. Not an earthquake, not any kind of structural failure. The floor moved the way water moves when something large passes through it. A ripple of energy that passed through stone like stone was just a suggestion. And at the end of the ripple, the passage ahead of them was full of darkness that was slightly more present than the surrounding dark. Kreth. She had read the briefing 3 times and drilled the contingencies and told herself she understood what she was walking into. She had not understood this. The briefing had said large. It had said powerful. It had used the phrase dimensional density, and she had understood it as a technical descriptor, and not as a thing she would feel in her chest like a second heartbeat, wrong-paced, insisting. Kreth was approximately twice her height. Its limbs were arranged differently from the lesser castes. 4 primary limbs, 2 secondary. The secondary folded against its torso like wings at rest. Its signal lantern eyes burned at the deepest violet, almost black, and the light they shed was not the scatter light of normal illumination but something directed, intentional, the light of something that looked because it chose to and always found what it looked at. It looked at her. "Human," it said, and the word came out at a frequency that she felt before she heard it. Not a voice that occupied space, a voice that occupied attention. She had the slug thrower out. She knew what the briefing said about slug throwers and Krethcast Krethve, and she raised it anyway, because the alternative was standing in the light of that gaze with her hands at her sides, and she was not built for that. "I would prefer," Kreth said, in trade dialect so clean and precise it hurt, "that you put that away. The projectile will not damage me in any lasting sense, and the noise will bring the garrison, and I would prefer that this conversation happen first." "You want to have a conversation. I want you to understand something," it said, "before I take back what you have taken, and before I invite you into the alignment." The secondary layer on the containment field already tried that. Something moved through Kreth's expression, the thing that moved through alien expressions that wasn't quite surprise but occupied the same space. "You passed the field. Your fear sensor is poorly calibrated for humans." A pause that had weight to it. "What is your name?" "Voss." "Voss?" It said the name the way you'd say a word in a language you just encountered, carefully, giving it the space to mean something. "You are here for the Veltiamond. You intend to prevent its use against your fleet at Reach Station." It was not a question. You are a single human operative in a garrison of 200. You came through the sewer access. You neutralized the guard construct. You navigated to the containment chamber without triggering a single interior alert. A pause. You are extraordinary for your kind. That's a thing you'd say to talk me into standing still. Yes, it said, with a simplicity that she hadn't expected. But it is also true. I have occupied 17 worlds. I have converted. It paused, and for just a moment the blank precision of its expression shifted into something she didn't have a word for. I have converted a great many humans. I understand your species comprehensively. You understand us like someone understands a lock, she said. What the tumblers do when you apply the right key. You don't understand us. Explain the difference. She almost laughed. She was in a passage with a creature that had ended 17 worlds, with a stolen device against her chest that was probably the most important object in 3 dimensions, with a converted garrison 2 floors above her. And the creature at the end of the passage wanted her to explain the difference between knowing a thing and understanding it. In the market today, she said. The girl. I observed that, it said. What did you observe? A human operative compromising her timeline and creating unnecessary risk to perform a gesture with no tactical value. That's what you saw. Yes. You saw a transaction, she said. Thing given, thing received, balance restored. You saw a step in a sequence. She looked at it. You didn't see that the whole point of it was that it wasn't a transaction, that it was done with no expectation of anything. That's the part you can't model. That's why your fear sensor was off. You built it based on what you think we're like, and you think we're like you think we act because we calculate. But a human will do something useless and costly and slow for no reason except that it seemed worth doing. And that breaks every model you have, because there's no frequency for worth in your signal. The corridor was silent for a moment. Give me the Veltiamond, Kreth said. No. It moved. For something that large, it moved without preamble, not the telegraphed lunge of something that trusted its size, but the efficient acceleration of something that had been planning this moment while it was speaking, that had been speaking precisely in order to set up this moment. She was already moving when it moved, already dropping low and sideways, the slug thrower coming up not at Kreth, but at the signal lantern array on the ceiling above it. 6 rounds, 2 lanterns. The passage dropped to near dark. Krethve's signal vision operated in the violet spectrum. In violet dark, a Krethcast should still have been fully operational, but she'd read the secondary briefing, the one marked speculative, the one that said the Krethcast maintained their signal density through active processing of environmental data, and that sudden information dropout, the abrupt cessation of sensory input, created a processing lag of approximately 4 seconds while the network rebalanced. 4 seconds was not a lot. She went past Kreth while it was rebalancing, through the gap its size created between its body and the left wall, the ceramic blade drawn and trailing across the signal lanterns on Kreth's torso array as she passed. Not a wound. Not deep enough to matter to something that size. But the lanterns sparked, and one of them went dark, and the signal it had been broadcasting stuttered and cut. Behind her, Ren had found the wall junction it had been moving toward while she'd been talking, and the wall junction opened onto the granary passage, and they were through it and running, while Kreth was still recalibrating in the dark behind them. The granary passage was 200 years old and had not been maintained by anyone in the last 4, and twice Kara went through a section of floor that had given up and had to catch herself on the timbers below. Ren moved through it without apparent difficulty, navigating by something that wasn't sight, and she followed the sound of it and the faint blue glow from its thorax vents, and didn't think about what was behind her. They came out through a collapsed section of the west wall into an alley that was dark and cold and smelled of the market's remains. Above them, the garrison alert had reached the city's signal lanterns. The whole of Vel Areth's skyline was burning violet-white, the city outlined in alien light like something that had been set on fire and hadn't noticed yet. Kara put her hand against the alley wall and caught her breath. "Kreth will not send the full garrison into the city," Ren said beside her. "The converted population is mixed with the unconverted. Using full garrison protocol and the city risks triggering a fear response in the unconverted that could produce mass panic and degrade conversion opportunities. So they'll be careful. They will be methodical, which is slower than careful. You have time." She looked at the transit device through the inner pocket seal, the pulse of it visible now in the bracer, steady, patient, the compressed distance of it waiting. "The extraction window is 40 hours from now. I need a place to hold in the city." Ren made a sound, not the music chord, something shorter, a single note, almost rueful. "I know a place," it said. "I should tell you, there is someone there." She looked at it. "The child," she said. "I told you I tried to ensure her survival, inadequately. But there is a section of the lower city that the garrison does not fully patrol. Older structures, very old. It paused. There is a word in Velan for a space that has been lived in for long enough that the living leaves a residue, that the walls remember the people." "Home," she said. "Close," it said. "Not exactly, but close." She straightened, checked the bracer, looked at the violet sky of Vel Areth and the garrison light sweeping the upper streets, and thought about 40 hours of holding a position, while a Kreth-cast intelligence ran a methodical search through a city of 100,000 people. "Lead the way," she said. The girl's name was Aval. Ren said it with the 4-note chord the way it said its own name, and then said Aval, which was the trade dialect approximation. She was in the basement of what had been a baker's house, with an old woman who turned out to be nobody's grandmother, just an old woman who'd opened her basement to anyone small enough to be in danger, which was a category that had grown considerably in 4 years. There were 6 children in the basement. Aval was the youngest. She looked up when Kara came down the steps, and there was a moment, a recognition that had nothing to do with having seen each other before. And then Aval looked at her hands and saw that they were empty. And then she looked at Kara's face. And then she looked down at the carved figure in her own arms and then back at Kara's face. And Kara saw the question she was asking without words, which was, "Are you staying?" "For a while," Kara said, which was the most honest answer she had. She sat up in the corner with sightlines to both the stairs and the cellar's single small window that looked out at street level, and she worked on the bracer's scanner to extend its range to the perimeter, and she listened to the garrison moving through the upper city in their careful, methodical way, and every 3 or 4 hours Ren would slip out through some passage she hadn't found and come back with information, and she started to understand what the creature had been doing in this city for the last 4 years. Not surviving, protecting, doing it inadequately by its own admission, unable to stop the conversion of most of the city, unable to prevent the occupation from grinding down the people who remained unconverted, but collecting small ones in basements, knowing which streets the garrison was slow to patrol, keeping track of food distributions and diverting small amounts to the places where the math was worst. One misaligned Krethve in a garrison of 200, doing what it could, which wasn't much, and doing it anyway. On the evening of the second day, Aval sat down next to her while she was working and put the carved figure down between them without comment and watched her work. After a while she asked, in Velan, something that Kara's trade dialect didn't fully cover. "She wants to know," Ren said from across the room, "what you are building." "A way out," Kara said. Aval said something else. "She asks if it is for everyone." Kara looked at the scanner. She looked at the extraction point coordinates in the bracer's display. She looked at the 6 children in the basement and the old woman who had opened her door, because there was no other door open, and Ren crouched in the corner with its thorax vents casting blue light on the ceiling. The extraction protocol was for 1 operative. The shuttle held 2. She thought about Command's briefing and Command's math, and the clean words Command used for things that weren't clean. Working on it, she said. The extraction point was a field outside the city's eastern edge, a flat space between the old road and the crop rows that had been fallow for 4 years. The pilot would hold on the ground for 11 minutes. After 11 minutes, the shuttle would leave. Kara had been running the modified plan for 6 hours by the time the garrison moved. They moved in the way Wren had predicted, methodical, spreading out from the palace in a grid pattern, working inward from the city's edges. They found the granary passage exit at hour 31. They found the alley at hour 33. They found the baker's house at hour 37. She heard them on the street above, the synchronized step, the absence of conversation, the sound of things that moved without uncertainty because they had a signal telling them where to go. She looked at the 6 children and the old woman and Wren. Now, she said. The passage Wren had found was older than the baker's house and possibly older than the city. It went under the foundations and came up in a drainage culvert outside the eastern wall, and it was exactly wide enough for a child to move through without difficulty, and exactly narrow enough to make an adult regret everything they'd ever eaten. She went through it 3 times, once to lead the first group out, once back in to get the second, once back in again for the old woman who had refused to go first and had now changed her mind. Wren held the basement while she was in the passage. She didn't ask what that meant and didn't think about it too carefully. The night outside the city wall was cold and very dark. The garrison alert had pulled the signal lanterns to full burn inside the city, which had the side effect of making the dark outside the city blacker than it would otherwise have been. She could see the extraction field because she knew where to look. She moved the children through the crop rows in groups of 2, one at a time. Avel last because Avel had somehow understood without being told that she should stay close and be last, and she didn't ask why. The shuttle was there. The light on its hull was red 11 minutes. She had burned 7 of them in the passage. She put the 6 children and the old woman on the shuttle and had a conversation with the pilot that covered about 30 seconds and settled nothing, and then she ran back into the crop rows because she had 4 minutes left and Wren had not come through the culvert. The culvert was dark. She put her head in and listened and heard nothing, and then she heard the sound of a passage being used by something large, and Wren came through it at the kind of speed that explained why it hadn't been first. "How many?" she said. 3, it said, and the wall access is open now. She looked at the shuttle, red light still 2 minutes. She ran. She made the shuttle with 47 seconds left, and the pilot had opinions about this that she heard approximately none of as she strapped in and checked that Wren had made it through the door before it sealed. The shuttle went vertical in a way that pressed everyone into their seats, and the 6 children made various sounds of alarm, and one of them, she realized, was laughing. She looked over. Avel, sitting strapped into a seat designed for an adult, the carved figure held in both hands, laughing at the way the launch pressed her into the cushion, as if the physical sensation of going up fast was the best thing that had happened to her in 4 years, which it probably was. Kara looked at her for a moment. Then she looked out the narrow viewport at Vel Areth receding below them, the violet lights of the garrison sweeping the city in their careful grid, the palace on its hill, the market square that was empty at this hour and dark. She had the Vel Tiamond. She had the mission. She had, in addition to those things, 7 people who had not been part of the mission, and 1 misaligned Krethve who had not been part of any plan she'd ever made. Command would have things to say about that. She was looking forward to the conversation. Wren sat across from her in the shuttle's small cargo compartment, while the pilot burned for the fold point. The children had fallen asleep in the main cabin. The old woman was awake but still, a kind of stillness that had seen too much to be moved by any additional things. Wren's thorax vents cast their faint blue light on the cargo compartment walls, slow and regular as breathing. "Can I ask you something?" Kara said. "Yes." "What you said about the child singing, the thing that started the misalignment." She looked at it. "You've been off the signal for 4 years. You've been in that city, in that garrison, surrounded by the alignment, with 200 aligned Krethve pressing the signal at you every day." She paused. "How do you stay misaligned?" Ren was quiet for a moment. Its expression did the thing alien expressions did, the thing that occupied the space of something but wasn't exactly the thing. "I make the music," it said, "every day, the sound that has no purpose except itself. I make it and I listen to it, and the signal knows that part of me is occupied with something it cannot use, and it cannot reach that part." Another pause. "It is a very small act. It protects a very small part of me. But the part it protects is the part that noticed the child and found her basement and counted her alive in my internal register. And as long as that part is there, the rest of me has something to organize itself around." Kara thought about this for a while. The shuttle hummed. Beyond the hull, the dark between Vel Arith and the fold point was enormous and very still. "You know you can't go back," she said. "Once we're through the fold, you're on the human side. They're going to have a lot of questions for you." "Yes," it said, "I know. They're going to want to study you, figure out how misalignment works, how to create it, whether it's replicable." "Yes." "That doesn't bother you." Another silence. "Then, on your world," it said, "are there children who sing?" She thought about her mother's apartment, the window over the courtyard summer evenings. "Yeah," she said, "quite a lot of them." "Then I am content to be studied," it said, and made the 4-note chord, and Kara felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. The Veltiamen pulsed once against her ribs, cold and steady, holding all its compressed distance quietly, waiting to be used for something better than it had been meant for. In the main cabin, one of the sleeping children made a small sound, and the old woman shifted and was still again. The shuttle crossed into the fold. The debrief lasted 11 days. It was not 11 days of pleasant conversation. Command had significant concerns about the additional passengers, and about Ren, and about the manner in which certain clearance protocols had been modified in the field without authorization, and Kara sat in a series of rooms and answered questions, and did not apologize for any of it. On the 6th day, an analyst from the Xenological Division came to talk to her about Ren's misalignment, and she told him what Ren had told her, and he wrote it all down carefully and left. And 3 days later, she heard from the debrief coordinator that the XD had determined that human music, specifically music produced by children, had a signal pattern that the Krethve neural influence system could not account for or process, which meant it was a gap in the system, which meant it was a possible countermeasure, which meant it was suddenly the most important discovery in the engagement against the Krethve in the 20-year history of that engagement. She asked what they were going to do with that information. The coordinator said they were going to develop it into a weapon. She was quiet for a moment. "Or," she said, "you could broadcast it." The coordinator looked at her. "Through every signal relay station in every occupied territory," she said. "Don't use it as a weapon, use it as a message. Every world the Krethve are on. Broadcast children singing, not a military frequency, an open one. Let the converted hear it. Let the garrison hear it. Let the misaligned ones who are hiding in the walls of every palace in every occupied city hear it and know they're not alone." She looked at him. "The Krethve can't convert a frequency they can't process. But anyone who's already been where Ren was, one moment, one sound that the signal couldn't explain, the first gap, they'll hear it and they'll know what it is." The coordinator wrote that down too. The 7 civilians from Vel Arith were resettled in the 3rd week, after medical clearance and the processing that the administration required. The 6 children were placed with a Velen community already established at Reach Station, a community that had not existed until the occupation of Vel Arith, which was how occupied worlds built their diasporas, by pieces. Ren was given a status that didn't have a category in existing law and would require 18 months of legislative work to fully resolve. In the interim, the XD gave it a consultant classification and an apartment near the station's residential ring and a specific human colleague to liaise with, which was how it ended up being the first Krethve in history to attend a primary school recital. Kara heard about that from the liaison, who described Ren sitting very still in the second row with its thorax vents, doing something the liaison couldn't interpret, while 23 children aged 5 through 8 performed a somewhat ragged but enthusiastic arrangement of something traditional. The liaison said Ren had been very quiet afterward and had not spoken for approximately an hour. She visited once at the settlement before she left for the next posting. The children were in a common space that the settlement had set up furniture in the Velen scale, which was lower to the ground, with a window overlooking the station's observation ring where you could see the stars. She sat with Avel for a while. Avel had found in the settlement's donation supplies a small amount of carving material. She'd been working on something. She showed it to Kara, an animal, four-legged, smaller than the first one with its head raised. Not as polished yet, still rough in places. "Yours," she said, in her approximation of trade dialect, which was getting better. Kara took it. The material was warm from Avel's hands, lighter than it looked. She sat with it for a while. Outside the window, the stars were the same stars she'd always known, the ones that were just starting in the maps she'd seen, to show empty spaces where the Krethve had been and were no longer, the first gaps widening slowly into something that might eventually look like freedom. She closed her fingers around the carving and felt the small carved ears under her thumb, worn smooth already from being held, and said nothing, because sometimes the thing that needed to be said had already been said without words in a market on a world that was still occupied but slightly less dark than it had been, and anything added to it would be surplus. She stayed until the stars shifted with the station's rotation, and then she said goodbye and meant it, and walked back out into the corridor where the next thing was waiting. She always walked toward the next thing. That was the most human part of her. That was the part nothing had ever managed to convert.